The night I heard the whispers begin, I was the only soul left in the massive silent warehouse. It was after midnight, just me and the endless rows of forgotten inventory, bathed in the sickly green glow of emergency lights. But it wasn't the silence that got to me. It was the faint, almost imperceptible sound of something else moving. Something that shouldn't have been there, hidden amongst the shadows. My name is Marc, and I'd been working the overnight shift at the old Bayside logistics facility for nearly 5 years. It was a sprawling, concrete labyrinth built on what used to be marshland, just outside of Chesapeake, Virginia. Most of the time, it was mind-numbingly boring, especially after everyone else clocked out. I'd spend my hours checking security feeds, logging deliveries, and occasionally doing a walkthrough of the main storage bays. The building itself had a certain aged, melancholy, peeling paint, drafty corridors, and an HVAC system that constantly groaned like a dying beast. It was the kind of place you didn't think much about during the day, but at night, its vast emptiness felt heavy, almost oppressive. I'd always considered myself a pretty rational guy, not easily spooked. I'd heard the old-timers tell stories about strange noises or equipment acting up, but I'd always chalked it up to an overactive imagination fueled by too much coffee and too little sleep. My routine was my anchor, a predictable rhythm in the quiet dark, and for the most part, it kept the creeping thoughts at bay. The first oddity was subtle, almost ignoble. A pallet jack I'd left secured in Bay 7 was found in Bay for the next morning, its battery dead. I figured I'd forgotten to secure it, or maybe a prank from the day shift, though it wasn't their style. Then came the whispers. It started during my patrol, a soft, indistinct murmuring that seemed to drift from the upper shelves in Bay 12, an area rarely accessed, piled high with discontinued electronics. I stopped, strained my ears. Nothing. Just the hum of the distant fluorescent lights and the creak of the old building settling. I dismissed it as air currents or my mind playing tricks. The following nights, however, the whispers grew clearer, more defined, though still too faint to make out actual words. They sounded like several voices, hushed and urgent, always just out of reach. I started taking my rounds with a flashlight, sweeping it across the darkened aisles, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was making the noise. Each time, the sound would cut off abruptly as I approached, only to resume once I moved on. One evening, I was in the security office, watching the feed from camera 6, which covered the main loading dock. For a split second, I saw a shadow flicker across the screen, impossibly tall and thin, moving with a speed that defied logic. I rewound the footage, frame by frame, but it was gone. Just a glitch, I told myself, a trick of the light or the old camera system. But a cold knot of dread began to form in my stomach. The feeling of being watched became constant, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I started leaving the main lights on in sections of the warehouse I wasn't currently in, a futile attempt to push back the encroaching darkness. One night, I was checking the temperature in the refrigerated storage unit, the massive door clanking shut behind me. The air was frigid, mist curling from my breath. As I turned to leave, I heard a sharp, distinct breath drawn in right behind me, so close I could feel a phantom chill on my ear. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the misty air, but there was nothing, only the shelves of frozen goods, silent and still. My heart hammered against my ribs. I practically fumbled with the heavy latch, desperate to get out. The climax arrived on a particularly stormy night. The wind howled outside, rattling the corrugated iron roof, and the power flickered intermittently. I was in Bay 9, logging some new inventory, when the lights went out completely, plunging the entire warehouse into a suffocating darkness. Only the feeble emergency lights kicked in, casting long, dancing shadows that distorted everything. That's when I heard it, loud and clear, right beside me. Not whispers this time, but a raspy guttural voice that seemed to vibrate through the very concrete floor. It was speaking my name. Mark. Double quotes, it rasped, drawn out and chillingly intimate. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The air around me grew impossibly cold, and I could smell something foul, like damp earth and decay. My flashlight, clutched in my trembling hand, illuminated nothing but the empty space in front of me. Then, a distinct thump directly behind me, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging itself across the floor, moving closer. I didn't dare turn around. I just ran, blindly crashing through the aisles, the rasping sound of my name and the dragging noise echoing through the darkness, chasing me. I made it to my car, fumbling with the keys, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The engine roared to life, and I sped out of the parking lot, not looking back. I never went back to Bayside Logistics. My supervisor called, concerned, but I couldn't explain what had happened. Not really. How do you describe a voice that calls your name in the dark? A dragging sound that follows you through an empty warehouse, and the feeling of something ancient and malevolent breathing down your neck. Now, even in my own apartment, when the house settles at night, I sometimes hear it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, carried on the air, just beyond the edge of hearing, calling my name. The last call I answered that night was the one that wasn't for me. A high-pitched, childish giggle echoing through the empty call center. I was the sole night operator, surrounded by rows of silent cubicles and the blinking red lights of abandoned phones. And that giggle was the first crack in the carefully constructed normalcy of my solitary shift. My name is Sarah, and for the past 2 years, my world had revolved around the graveyard shift at Connect Solutions, a 24/7 customer service center situated in a bland, 2-story building in a quiet business park outside of Phoenix, Arizona. Most nights were a blur of minor technical support issues, billing inquiries, and the occasional disgruntled customer. From 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., it was just me. The building itself was generic, beige walls, worn carpet, and the ever-present hum of the server room. During the day, it bustled with hundreds of agents, but by night, it transformed into a cavernous, echoing shell. I liked the solitude, for the most part. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to my chaotic home life. I'd bring my books, my noise-canceling headphones, and settle into the quiet rhythm of the night. The only sounds were my own typing, the occasional ping of a new incoming call, and the distant, almost comforting drone of the AC unit. I considered myself pragmatic, not one for ghost stories or superstitions. This was just a job, a way to pay the bills. And the stillness of the deserted office was a bonus, not a source of dread. The odd occurrences started subtly. One night, I found a child's drawing, crayon bright, and depicting stick figures holding hands, taped to my monitor. I assumed it was a forgotten item from one of the day shift parents, who sometimes brought their kids in for a few hours after school. I took it down, filed it away in the lost and found. A few nights later, a specific chair in the cubicle across from mine, which I always pushed in neatly, would be found pulled out, as if someone had just been sitting there. I'd shrug it off, attributing it to the cleaning crew, or maybe even my own absent-mindedness. But then, the noises began. Soft taps on the dividers, the distinct sound of a chair rolling back, a faint clearing of a throat from an empty cubicle. They were always just at the periphery of my hearing, easily dismissed as the building settling or the wind outside. However, the giggles were different. They started as mere whispers, like children playing very, very far away. I'd pull off my headphones, listen intently, but they would vanish. Then, during a particularly slow night, a call came in on line 3. It flashed red, indicating a new customer. I answered with my usual, "Thank you for calling Connect Solutions. My name is Sarah. How may I help you?" All I heard was the distinct, innocent sound of a child giggling, followed by the click of the line disconnecting. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a prank call. There was an unsettling purity to the sound. I checked the call logs, but there was no record of the incoming number. Over the next few weeks, the giggles became more frequent, always on disconnected lines, always just out of reach. I began to feel a presence, like unseen eyes watching me from the shadows between the cubicles. The air in the office often felt heavy, despite the AC, and a faint, sweet smell, like old candy, would sometimes drift through the air, only to disappear as quickly as it came. I started leaving the lights on in other sections of the office, finding the all-encompassing darkness too oppressive. I'd sometimes catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, a flash of white, a tiny shadow darting behind a desk, but whenever I turned, there was nothing. My sleep suffered. I found myself jumping at shadows, constantly listening. The building, once a haven of peace, now felt like a cage, and I, the only occupant, was being hunted by something playful and terribly old. One stormy night, the power flickered violently, plunging the entire call center into momentary darkness before the emergency lights hummed to life. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. I was the only one in the entire vast space. Suddenly, all the phones on the main switchboard lit up simultaneously, a horrifying cacophony of ringing. I stared, paralyzed, as every single red light pulsed, demanding attention. Then, from the very back of the call center, where the training rooms were, I heard it. A small, clear voice, singing a nursery rhyme. It was faint at first, then grew louder, closer, echoing unnaturally through the empty space. Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of quietest ... double quotes. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that there was no child in the building. Yet the voice continued, drawing nearer, the nursery rhyme chillingly distorted by the echoes. I saw a small, flickering shadow, barely visible in the emergency light, move from behind a row of cubicles, then another, then another. They were indistinct, tiny, like distorted outlines of children. The air dropped to an icy temperature, and the sweet, sickly smell of old candy filled my nostrils, overpowering everything else. The singing grew louder, the giggles joining in, a chorus of innocent voices that felt utterly malicious. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. A small, cold hand, impossibly small and frail, brushed against my arm. I screamed. I don't remember much after that, just a blur of adrenaline and sheer terror. I sprinted out of the office, leaving my bag, my phone, everything behind. I didn't even bother to lock up. I just ran, never looking back, until I was safely in my car and miles away. I quit the next day, of course, giving some vague excuse about a family emergency. They understood, but the look in my supervisor's eyes, the knowing pity, told me they'd probably heard similar stories before. Even now, months later, when I'm alone and the silence stretches too long, I sometimes hear it, a faint, distant giggle, or the echo of a child's song. And sometimes, a sweet, cloying scent will waft through my apartment. A chilling reminder of the night I was truly alone, at work. The deeper I went into the mine, the more the air itself seemed to press in, thick with dust and an ancient, unsettling silence. Then, a single, deliberate tap echoed through the darkness, far deeper than I'd ever ventured, a sound that shouldn't have been there, because I was the only living thing for miles. My name is David, and for the past year, I'd been working as a night watchman for the old Blackwood mine, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. It had been shut down for decades, deemed too dangerous and unprofitable. but a small crew was still tasked with monitoring for structural integrity and preventing copper theft from the abandoned sections. My shift started at sunset and ended with the first hint of dawn, a lonely vigil over collapsing timbers and forgotten shafts. The main office was a small, dusty shack at the entrance, connected to an elaborate system of pressure sensors and motion detectors placed throughout the accessible parts of the mine. The mine itself was a vast, cold maw, tunnels stretching for miles underground, some flooded, some choked with rock. The air was always heavy with the smell of damp earth and stale minerals. I was a man who preferred his own company, and the isolation of the mountains suited me. I'd grown up in a small town nearby, so I knew the local legends of the mountain folk and strange disappearances. But I always dismissed them as old wives' tales, products of too much moonshine and vivid imaginations. My job was simple: monitor the sensors, make a perimeter check, and occasionally venture into the upper sections to replace a faulty detector. The first hint that something was amiss came not from a sensor, but from the faint scent of wood. One particularly cold night, as I was making my rounds near the main entrance, a faint aroma of burning wood drifted on the frigid air. It wasn't the smell of my own small fire in the watchman's shack, but something wilder, deeper. I searched the immediate area, thinking perhaps some hikers had made a rogue campfire, but found nothing. The scent vanished as quickly as it had appeared. A few nights later, the motion sensor for Section C, an old, partially flooded tunnel leading to a deeper, collapsed shaft, kept triggering intermittently. Each time I checked the feed, there was nothing, just the murky water and ancient rock. I'd reset it, attributing it to a loose wire or perhaps a rat, but the triggers became more frequent, always in Section C, always for only a second or two. Then, the sounds began. Soft, almost imperceptible scratching noises, like fingernails dragging across rock, coming from the ventilation shafts that snaked throughout the mine. I'd rap on the metal, hoping to scare away whatever critter was making the racket, but the scratching would only stop for a moment before resuming, often from a different part of the mine. One night, I was down in a more stable upper section, replacing a sensor, when my lamp flickered. In the brief moment of darkness, I distinctly heard what sounded like a series of low, rhythmic thumps, like something heavy being dragged, coming from a side tunnel that was supposedly completely collapsed and impassable. I froze, my heart pounding, waiting for my lamp to come back on. When it did, the sound was gone. I spent the rest of that night with a knot in my stomach. The legends of the mountain folk, of things that lived deep within the earth, began to creep into my thoughts. I started carrying an old, heavy pickaxe with me on my rounds, more for psychological comfort than actual defense. The feeling of being watched intensified, a chill that had nothing to do with the mine's temperature. I'd often find myself staring into the vast, lightless openings of deeper tunnels, feeling an inexplicable pull, a dark curiosity that both terrified and fascinated me. The escalating dread reached its terrifying peak during a deep maintenance run. The main pressure sensor in the lowest accessible shaft, Shaft 17, had gone completely dark, a critical failure. This shaft was usually off limits due to instability, but protocol dictated it had to be checked. Armed with a heavy-duty lamp, my pickaxe, and a palpable sense of unease, I descended into the suffocating darkness. The deeper I went, the more the air grew thick and heavy, and an oppressive silence pressed in, broken only by the drip of unseen water and my own ragged breathing. I reached the sensor's location, a narrow passage barely wide enough to walk through. The air here was strangely still, devoid of any natural currents. As I knelt to examine the faulty unit, my lamp beam danced over the rough-hewn rock walls, revealing nothing but ancient strata. Suddenly, a low guttural growl vibrated through the rock itself, seemingly emanating from the wall directly beside me. It wasn't an animal sound. It was something ancient, primal, filled with an unfathomable rage. My blood ran cold. The growl intensified, and then a series of heavy, deliberate taps echoed from deeper within the rock, as if something massive was striking the tunnel wall, testing its limits. My lamp began to flicker erratically, plunging the shaft into momentary darkness with each terrifying growl and tap. I could smell something rank, like decaying flesh and damp earth, filling the air. Then, from the very end of the narrow passage, where my light couldn't quite reach, 2 pinpricks of dull yellow light appeared, gleaming with malevolent intelligence. They were eyes, and they were staring directly at me. A low, raspy whisper slithered out from the darkness, a language I didn't understand, but its intent was crystal clear. "You are not welcome here." The eyes began to move, slowly, deliberately, closer. I scrambled back, dropping my tools, the pickaxe clattering uselessly on the rock floor. I didn't look back, just scrabbled, clawed, and stumbled my way out of that suffocating tunnel. The growl and the rhythmic tapping echoing behind me, chasing me up the shaft. I burst out of the mine entrance into the cold night air, gasping, shaking, completely disoriented. I quit that very morning, leaving my keys and a terse resignation note on the watchman's desk. I never looked back at Blackwood Mine. Now, even back in civilization, the deep, primeval silence of the mountains seems to follow me. Sometimes, when the night is particularly still, I can still hear it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. Deep within the earth, a sound meant only for things that live in the dark,